Ada Ellsworth stood up before she had even decided to stand. That was the truth of it, the part that would shake her awake in the dark hours of the night for years afterward, the absolute absence of premeditation. One moment she was sitting in the third row of the Territorial Land Office in Abilene, Kansas, on the sweltering afternoon of July 14, 1876, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her jaw set against the indignity of what she was witnessing, and the next moment she was on her feet, her voice cutting clean through the suffocating air of that cramped, cedar-paneled room. "Your Honor, I have testimony relevant to this proceeding." The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind. It was the silence of 43 men turning to look at a woman who had not been called upon, had not been invited, and who most of them believed had no business being there at all. Judge Harold Briggs, a barrel-chested man with a white mustache that curled at the corners like a sleeping cat, peered down at her over spectacles that had slid halfway down his bulbous nose. "Miss," he paused, shuffling papers, irritated. "Miss Ellsworth. This is a formal land arbitration. Witnesses must be sworn and recognized by the court before they speak." "Then swear me in," Ada said, and her voice did not shake. She was 26 years old. She had not planned any of this. She had come to this hearing only because she had been seated next to the door, and the heat outside was marginally worse than the heat inside. But she had heard things this afternoon that had turned something cold and hard in her chest, and she was not the kind of woman who sat still when injustice was being assembled in front of her like a piece of crooked carpentry. At the front of the room, at the single table reserved for the petitioner, Frederick Carver sat alone. He had no lawyer. He had one sheet of paper, creased so many times along the same folds that the words written on it were partially obscured by the soft white lines of worn fiber. His boots were cracked at the toe. His jacket, which might once have been a good jacket, had been mended at the elbow with thread that did not quite match. He was 30 years old, lean in the way that men get lean when there is not always enough to eat, with dark brown hair and gray eyes that had a quality of stillness in them, not emptiness. Ada would later insist to anyone who would listen, but stillness, like deep water that nothing had disturbed yet. He had not looked at her when she rose. He had barely looked at anyone since the proceeding began, because he had clearly understood within the first 5 minutes that the outcome of this hearing had been arranged before a single word was spoken. Across from him, at a table twice as wide, and flanked by 2 attorneys from Topeka, sat Harlan Graves. Harlan Graves was not the richest man in Dickinson County, but he was positioned to become that, and in 1876 on the Kansas plains, position was nearly indistinguishable from the thing itself. He wore a dove-gray suit. He had a gold watch chain. He had 2 lawyers and a surveyor and a notary, and a thick leather folder full of documents that bore official seals in 3 different colors of wax. Frederick Carver had 1 sheet of paper. He had settled that land, 160 acres of tall grass prairie along the fork of Mud Creek, 3 years prior, under the terms of the Homestead Act of 1862. He had broken the sod himself, by hand and mule. He had built a house. He had planted and harvested 2 seasons of winter wheat, and 1 very hard season where the crop had failed, and he had eaten through the winter on dried beans and his own pride. He had done everything the law required. And Harlan Graves, who had money enough to retain surveyors who could be persuaded to make small errors that shifted boundary lines just slightly, and lawyers who knew how to bury a homesteader in procedural objections, had decided he wanted that land because the creek that ran through it was worth more than Frederick Carver's entire life savings, which at the current moment stood at $11.40. Ada knew all of this because she had spent the last hour listening very carefully. She also knew something else, something that Harlan Graves's lawyers did not know she knew. Judge Briggs looked at Ada for a long moment. She could see him calculating. She was not nobody. Her father, James Ellsworth, had owned the largest dry goods establishment in Abilene before he died 2 winters past. Her uncle was a county commissioner. She was not the sort of woman a judge in a small territorial town could simply dismiss without consequence. He cleared his throat. "Very well, Miss Ellsworth. Bailiff, please administer the oath." At the petitioner's table, Frederick Carver finally turned and looked at her. She would remember his expression for the rest of her life. It was not hope. Hope was too bright a thing for what was on his face. It was something more bewildered than that and more fragile. It was the expression of a man who had stopped expecting anything from anyone, encountering the inexplicable fact of being surprised. Ada walked to the front of the room, placed her hand on the Bible the bailiff produced, and swore to tell the truth. Then she told it. To understand what happened in that room, and why it mattered, and why it became the first thread in something neither Ada Ellsworth nor Frederick Carver had seen coming, you have to go back 3 weeks. You have to go back to the morning of June 24th, 1876, when a wagon with a broken wheel axle sat tilted in the middle of the road that ran north out of Abilene, and a man Ada had never seen was crouched in the dust beside it, doing arithmetic with his eyes closed. She had been driving herself to the mill, an act that her aunt considered scandalous and Ada considered entirely reasonable, when she had come around the bend in her father's old buckboard and nearly driven straight into the listing wagon. She pulled her horse up hard, and the dust settled around them both, and she saw the man in the road. He was trying to figure out whether he could afford to replace the axle. She could see it in the way his lips moved slightly, in the way his hand went to his jacket pocket and stayed there, pressing against something. She had watched her father do the same arithmetic 1,000 times in the dry years, that silent, invisible calculation where a man counts what he has against what he needs and tries to find a way to make the smaller number become the larger one. "Can I help?" Ada had asked, because she was not the kind of woman who drove past things. He had looked up at her. Those gray eyes, that quality of stillness. "Unless you have an axle and a pin," he said. "Probably not, but thank you." "I have a rope," Ada said, "and I'm going to the mill. The blacksmith is adjacent to it. I could pull your wagon there if you moved some of the weight out of the bed." He had looked at her for a moment as if assessing whether this was real or a complicated kind of joke the universe was playing on him. Then he had nodded once slowly. "Frederick Carver," he said, "I appreciate it." "Ada Ellsworth," she said, "let's get this done before the heat gets worse." They moved his supplies out of the wagon bed, 2 sacks of seed grain, a box of nails, a coil of wire fencing, a bedroll, a coffee tin that had been used so many times it had a patina the color of old wood, and stacked them at the roadside. Ada helped. She did not stand back and supervise. She picked up the nail box and set it down in the grass, and she could see that this surprised him even more than the offer of help had. The rope from her buckboard to his wagon frame held, and she drove slowly, and the crippled wagon groaned behind her, and Frederick Carver walked alongside holding the lead of his mule, a gray animal of considerable age and dignity named, as she would learn, Clement. They did not talk much on that road. But the silence had a quality to it that was different from the silences Ada usually kept with people. Most silences were either polite or uncomfortable. This one was simply present, like the heat, like the sound of the grasshoppers working in the tall grass on either side of the road, like the slow creak of wheels. At the blacksmith's shop, while the smith looked over the axle and named a price that made a muscle in Frederick's jaw tighten and release, Ada stood nearby and pretended not to notice. The smith's name was Pete Acaffer, a broad-shouldered man whose family had come to Kansas during the early homestead years, and he was fair in his pricing but not cheap, because good iron work in 1876 was neither fast nor inexpensive. $5 for the axle and the labor, Pete said. Frederick nodded, the careful nod of a man who has already decided to say yes before he has fully confirmed in his own mind that he can manage it. He reached into his jacket. Ada had turned away by then, going to talk to Pete's apprentice about the mill wait time, and she heard nothing more of it. Only later, much later, Would she understand that the money Frederick spent on that axle was very nearly everything he had, and that the $11.40 he would bring to his land hearing 3 weeks later represented the careful accumulation of every odd job and sold egg and traded service of the intervening weeks? She saw him again on the 4th of July at the town celebration on the green by the courthouse. Not a formal meeting, just the collision of two people in a crowd, a moment of mutual recognition, his slight nod, her small smile. He had been standing at the edge of the gathering, not quite participating, not quite separate. She had noticed that he was alone, and she had noticed that he seemed accustomed to it. She had walked over to him because she was Ada Ellsworth, and she operated by a certain internal logic that other people sometimes found surprising. "Your wagon got fixed," she observed. "Your rope held," he said. "I should have returned it to you at the time. I can bring it by." "Keep it," she said. "I have others." He looked at her. In the fading afternoon light of the 4th of July, with the fiddle music starting up somewhere behind them and the smell of roasting meat on the air, she saw something in his expression that she catalogued without naming, a warmth that he was containing carefully, as a man contains a flame in windy weather, cupping his hands around it because he is not sure of his right to let it grow. "How is your farm?" she asked. "The wheat looks good," he said. "If the weather holds, and the land hearing." She asked because she had heard talk the way you hear things in a small town in pieces, the way rumor assembles itself out of fragments about Harlan Graves and his designs on the creek property. The stillness in Frederick's eyes went a shade deeper. "I'll manage," he said. "Do you have a lawyer?" A pause. "I understand the law." "That is not the same thing as having a lawyer," Ada said. He looked at her with a directness that she found, to her slight surprise, entirely comfortable. "Miss Ellsworth, lawyers cost money I don't have. The law says the land is mine. I filed in 1873. I've met every requirement. I have my documentation." "I know," Ada said. "But Harlan Graves has lawyers who know how to make documentation seem insufficient." He did not answer for a moment. The fiddle behind them was joined by a banjo. Someone laughed loudly near the food tables. "Why do you know about Harlan Graves and my land?" he asked, and it was not suspicious, only genuinely curious. "Because I live here," Ada said, "and I pay attention." Something shifted in his expression. Not the warmth now, something quieter than that, something that went a little deeper, like a key turning in a lock that had not been opened in a long time. "You should pay attention to the dancing," he said, and there was the ghost of something that might have been a smile. "It's the 4th of July. I don't dance," Ada said, "but I do eat. Have you had the pulled pork?" "I've had the pulled pork," he said. "It's excellent." They ended up sitting on the courthouse steps eating pie from the church ladies' table and talking for an hour and a half about things that had nothing to do with land disputes or lawyers or Harlan Graves. They talked about the grasshopper plague of 1874, which had stripped half the farms in the county and forced Frederick to plant again from scratch with borrowed seed. They talked about Ada's father's store, which she had run for 8 months after his death before her uncle had deemed it improper and arranged for a male manager. They talked about the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, which neither of them had attended but which Ada had read about extensively in the newspaper, and described with such careful, specific detail that Frederick listened the way a person listens to a story they deeply wish were happening to them. He walked her to her buckboard when the evening got late and the mosquitoes got bad. He did not offer to drive her home, because that would have been presumptuous, and she would have refused anyway, because she was Ada Ellsworth and she had been managing her own transportation since she was 17. But he stood at the side of the buckboard while she gathered the reins, and he said, "Thank you for the company." "I enjoyed it," she said, and she had. She drove home through the dark Kansas night under a sky so full of stars it looked implausible, and she thought about his hands. She had noticed his hands, because a woman always notices hands, and his were calloused and capable and not entirely clean, because no honest working man's hands ever were, and she thought about the quality of his attention when she spoke. The way he listened as if what she said actually mattered, as if she were a person whose thoughts were worth following. It had been a long time since anyone had listened to her that way. Her Aunt Mildred, with whom she now lived in her father's house on Chestnut Street, listened to Ada the way most people in Abilene listened to her, with a vague, benign inattention that assumed her words were pleasant sounds rather than actual content. Mildred was not cruel. She was simply of the firm conviction that women existed slightly to the side of whatever was actually happening, and that this arrangement was natural and comfortable for everyone. Ada had spent 26 years disagreeing. 3 weeks passed. The wheat grew. The hearing date was posted on the courthouse door and in the Abilene Chronicle on the first day of July, and Ada read it in her kitchen over her morning coffee and thought about Frederick Carver's gray eyes and the $11 or so she suspected stood between him and disaster. She went to the hearing because she wanted to see what would happen. She told herself it was civic interest. She told herself a lot of things on the drive there, but her hands on the reins were a little tight, and when she walked into the land office and saw him sitting alone at that table with his one creased sheet of paper, something in her chest contracted sharply. She found a seat in the third row and she listened. Harlan Graves's lawyers were good. She gave them that. They were expensive and they were thorough, and they had documents that she could not have produced on short notice. The primary argument was a surveying discrepancy, a claim that Frederick's original homestead filing contained an error in the boundary description, specifically the northeastern corner markers, which Graves's surveyor had remeasured and found to be incorrect by a margin of 40 feet, meaning that the northeast portion of Frederick's claimed acreage, which happened to include the most productive section of Mud Creek, technically fell within a parcel that had never been formally claimed and was therefore open to application. Graves was applying. It was very neat. Ada, who had helped her father navigate 2 property disputes in his years as a merchant, could see the architecture of the trap clearly. The survey discrepancy was not a lie, necessarily. There were genuine inaccuracies in many of the original homestead filings, because the government surveyors in the early 1870s had been overworked and underpaid and sometimes drunk. But the way Graves's lawyers were presenting it, the inaccuracy somehow cast doubt on the entirety of Frederick's claim, a logical leap that the law did not support, but that could be made to seem reasonable to a judge who was not paying careful attention. And Judge Briggs, Ada noticed, was paying careful but selective attention, the kind of attention that had a shape already determined by something that had happened before the hearing began. Frederick had spoken twice. Both times he had been interrupted by procedural objections from Graves's lawyers, objections that were technically legitimate but that served primarily to knock him off his rhythm and prevent him from making his full argument. He was not a lawyer. He knew the law, just as he had said, but he did not know the performance of law, the theater of it, the way a practiced attorney could use the rules of procedure as both shield and weapon. He was holding his own, but barely. He was a man swimming in a river whose current he had underestimated. Ada watched him for 20 minutes before she identified the thing she knew. The survey. Graves's surveyor, a man named Walt Heller, who had testified with his hands folded and his eyes cast downward in the careful way of someone reciting memorized text, had stated that he had conducted his remeasurement of the northeastern boundary on June 15, 1876. He had described the methodology, the instruments used, the conditions on the day. He had been very specific about June 15th. Ada knew where Walt Heller had been on June 15, 1876. She knew because on June 15th, Ada had been at the home of Constance Pauling, helping with the quilting circle that met on the 3rd Tuesday of each month. And Walt Heller's wife, Margaret, was a member of the quilting circle, and Margaret Heller had said, while they were all bent over the frame with their needles, that Walt was away in Topeka for the week seeing about some business, and that she did not like being alone in the house, but Walt said it could not be helped. Walt Heller had been in Topeka on June 15th. He had not been on Frederick Carver's land. Ada had sat with this knowledge for 3 minutes before she understood its implications. If Heller's survey had not been conducted on June 15th, if he had fabricated the date and therefore possibly the entire survey, then the foundational document of Graves's claim was fraudulent, not technically arguable, not a matter of interpretation. Fraudulent. She stood up, and that is where we came in. After the bailiff administered the oath and Ada stood before Judge Briggs with 43 pairs of eyes on her, and her heart beating in a way that she was determined not to let show on her face, she took one breath and she spoke. "Your Honor, Mr. Heller testified that he conducted his boundary survey on June 15th of this year. I can testify under oath that on June 15th, Mr. Heller was not in Dickinson County. He was in Topeka, Kansas. I know this because his wife, Margaret Heller, stated as much to me personally and to 11 other women at a quilting gathering on that date. His survey either occurred on a different date than claimed, or it did not occur at all." The room went still. Then it went the other kind of still, the kind that precedes a storm. Harlan Graves's lead attorney, a man named Clifford Marsh, was on his feet instantly. "Your Honor, this is an improper interruption. This woman has no standing in this proceeding." "She has standing," Judge Briggs said very quietly. "I swore her in. Sit down, Mr. Marsh." Marsh sat down. The room watched him do it. Ada continued. "I can provide the names of the other 11 women present at the quilting circle who can corroborate this. Additionally, I believe the Topeka Hotel records from June 15th and surrounding dates would show Mr. Heller's registration. If the survey date is fraudulent, the validity of the entire remeasurement must be called into question, and Mr. Graves's application rests on nothing." She stopped speaking. She stood with her hands at her sides, not clasped, not fidgeting. She waited. Judge Briggs looked at her. He looked at Walt Heller, who had developed a particular pallor. He looked at Clifford Marsh, who was conferring in fierce whispers with his co-counsel. He looked at Harlan Graves, who was looking at Walt Heller with an expression that could most accurately be described as the face of a man calculating how expensive this particular mistake was about to become. Then Judge Briggs looked at Frederick Carver. Frederick was looking at Ada. She met his eyes only for a second. His expression was indescribable. She looked away, back at the judge. "Mr. Heller," Briggs said, "do you wish to revise your testimony?" Heller looked at Graves. Graves looked at his lawyers. His lawyers looked at the floor. Heller revised his testimony. It came out over the next painful hour that the survey had been conducted not by Heller himself, but by an assistant, on a date in early June before the homestead filing deadline, and that Heller had reviewed the assistant's notes and measurements and signed the documentation without personally verifying the work. The June 15th date had been, in Heller's carefully chosen words, a clerical error. It was not a clerical error. Everyone in the room knew it was not a clerical error. Judge Briggs knew it most of all. But Heller had given them a scaffold, and Briggs had a way out of an extremely embarrassing situation, and he took it. He ruled in favor of Frederick Carver. The original boundary marker stood. The land was Frederick's. All 160 acres, including the most productive section of Mud Creek. Harlan Graves's application was denied. Briggs adjourned the hearing with the finality of a man who wanted to be somewhere else as quickly as possible, and the room filled immediately with noise, the scrape of chairs, the surge of voices, the particular energy of a crowd that has witnessed something unexpected and is rapidly converting it into story. Ada gathered her gloves and her small bag and moved toward the door. She was not attempting to flee exactly. She simply did not want to stand in the middle of the room while people stared at her and argued about what she had done. She made it almost to the door. "Miss Ellsworth," she stopped. She turned. Frederick Carver was standing 4 feet away, hat in hand. Up close, in the light from the tall windows of the land office, she could see things she had not been close enough to see at the courthouse steps on the 4th of July. A small scar through his left eyebrow. the particular shade of gray in his eyes that was not cold gray but warm gray, the gray of a winter sky just before it snows when the light is still present and diffused. He had the look of a man who has been fighting something alone for so long that the prospect of not being alone is something he does not entirely know how to hold. He stopped, started again. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Ada said. It was the truth, I just told the truth. You put yourself in front of Harlan Graves, he said. He is not a man who forgives that. I'm not afraid of Harlan Graves, Ada said, and this was mostly true. And the law was on your side. The law was on my side before, he said. That wasn't going to be enough. They stood there in the emptying room with the noise and heat around them, and Ada looked at him and he looked at her, and she felt again that quality she had noticed on the courthouse steps, the thing she had felt when he listened to her, the sensation of mattering to someone's attention. I owe you, he said quietly. You don't, she said. But if you feel that way, you could buy me a cup of coffee at the hotel. I didn't eat this morning, and I'm lightheaded from the heat and the anxiety of talking in front of 43 men who wanted me to be quiet. Something happened to his expression. That almost smile, the one she had seen before, became an actual smile, slow and a little unguarded and unexpectedly beautiful. It transformed his whole face, the way sunlight transforms a landscape. Ada looked at it and felt something shift in her chest in a way that was not at all about justice or land rights. Coffee, he said. Yes, I can manage that. They walked out of the land office together into the white blast of the Kansas afternoon. The street was dusty and bright. Somewhere a horse was being shod, the rhythmic ring of iron on iron. A group of men on the steps of the general store watched them pass with the particular attention that small towns pay to unusual combinations. At the hotel, the Drovers' Rest, the only establishment in Abilene that served meals to ladies unaccompanied by a male relative without making them sit in a separate room, they found a table near the window, and Ada ordered coffee and a plate of biscuits, and Frederick ordered coffee and paid for both with careful attention to the coins. They sat across from each other in the filtered afternoon light and began to talk. Not about the hearing. Not right away. By some mutual, unspoken agreement, they talked around it the way you talk around something hot, circling it, letting it cool. Frederick asked about the quilting circle, and Ada told him about Constance Pauling's house and the 16-block pattern they had been working on, and she made him laugh once, that same slow, unguarded laugh, when she described the great argument of the summer over whether blue or green was the more appropriate border color, and how it had nearly ended 2 decades of friendship. Then he told her about the farm. He talked about it differently than she expected, not with the defensive pride of a man justifying himself, but with genuine, unaffected love. The particular way the creek ran at the bend nearest the house, making a sound in the early morning that he had never managed to describe adequately. The color of the wheat when it was just coming up, that improbable green that looked too vivid against the brown earth to be real. The way Clement the mule had decided on his own, without instruction, to always come to the barn door at sunset, and how this habit had become the most reliable clock Frederick owned. Ada listened to him describe the farm and felt something that she could only call recognition, as if she were hearing a language she had not spoken in a long time but had never entirely forgotten. She had grown up with her father's stories of building his store, the same quality of love for a thing made and tended, the pride that was not vanity but investment, the attachment that went deeper than economics. You love it, she said, not a question. I do, he said simply. It's the only thing I've built in my life. It's the first place that was mine. Ada thought about her father's house on Chestnut Street, which was technically hers, and which she shared with Aunt Mildred, who ran it with the efficiency of a general and the warmth of someone who had learned warmth as a concept rather than a practice. She thought about the dry goods store which she had managed competently for 8 months before her uncle had decided a woman could not do it. The first place that's mine, she repeated. That's something worth fighting for. "You fought harder for it than I did today," he said, and the humor in it was dry and a little self-deprecating, but the gratitude beneath it was real and vast. "You would have thought of something," Ada said. "Maybe." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Maybe not. They had it sewn up pretty tight. I knew it when I walked in. I just didn't." He paused. "I didn't know what else to do but go." The honesty of that landed on Ada like light. He had gone anyway. With his one creased sheet of paper and his cracked boots and his $11, he had walked into a room full of power and money that was arranged against him, and he had sat down and made his case and not flinched. Not because he had expected to win, but because the land was his and he had no other option, and he was not the kind of man who did not show up. Ada thought about that for a long time afterward. The weeks following the land hearing in Abilene moved the way Kansas summer weeks did, hot and slow in the middle, and then suddenly punctuated by violent afternoons, thunderstorms that rolled in from the southwest with the speed and noise of something alive, turning the sky green and dropping rain that smelled of iron and earth. Ada went about her life with Aunt Mildred in the house on Chestnut Street. She helped with the church bazaar. She read every newspaper she could get her hands on, because reading was what she did when she felt too large for her circumstances, and she frequently felt too large for her circumstances. She thought about Frederick Carver more than was strictly explainable. She thought about the way he had looked at her in the doorway of the land office, that expression that she could not quite name. She thought about the farm, the creek, the wheat, old Clement appearing at the barn door at sunset. She thought about what it would be like to have a place that was truly yours. She did not see him for 10 days. Then, on a Thursday morning in late July, she was in the dry goods store, the store her father had built, now managed by a man named Gerald Toft, who treated her with the particular condescension of someone who is grateful for having replaced you picking up thread and a bolt of cotton. When the door bell rang and Frederick Carver walked in, he stopped when he saw her. She stopped when she saw him. Then they both moved toward each other at the same time, and there was a brief, awkward pause where they both almost spoke simultaneously and both stopped simultaneously, which resolved itself in the only way it could, with laughter, his low and warm, hers quick and bright. "I was going to come by," he said. "I've been meaning to." "I don't live at the store," Ada said. "I know, I meant your house on Chestnut." He paused. "I wanted to bring something, I wasn't sure of the proper form, a thank you, but also," he stopped, tried again. "I wanted to see how you were." Ada looked at him. He had a better shirt on than he'd worn to the hearing. Still not a wealthy man's shirt, but clean and carefully pressed, which meant he had pressed it himself because she could not imagine him having anyone else to do it. He held his hat in his hands. His gray eyes had that quality she was becoming convinced was specific and irreducible, that particular stillness that she had begun to think of not as restraint but as depth, a quality of interior space. "I'm well," she said. "How is the farm?" "The farm is good. The wheat is—" He stopped himself, and she saw him recalibrate, perhaps thinking he talked about the wheat too much. "The farm is very good. The hearing hasn't been challenged. I went and spoke to the county clerk, and everything is confirmed in the records. Harlan Graves hasn't made any more trouble. Not yet." His jaw tightened slightly. "I expect he will, eventually. Men like that don't accept outcomes they didn't choose." "No," Ada agreed. "They don't." She looked at him. "Are you worried?" "I'm prepared," he said, which was a different thing, and they both knew it. "I'm also—" He looked at the bolt of cotton she was holding. "I'm interrupting your shopping." "I was almost done," Ada said. "Would you walk with me, afterward, if you have time?" She put the cotton on the counter and told Gerald Toft she would collect it tomorrow, because she did not want to wait while he cut and measured it. And Gerald Toft gave her the particular look of a man who suspects he is being inconvenienced by someone who used to outrank him, and resents the residual power of that. She ignored him with the magnificent ease of long practice. They walked north along the main street of Abilene and then turned onto the quieter residential road that led toward the edge of town, where the houses thinned and the prairie reasserted itself. the tall grass bending in the late morning wind. They walked side by side without quite touching, and they talked. He had brought her something after all. He had remembered in the chaos of first seeing her that he had put it in his jacket pocket. It was a small bunch of wildflowers, the kind that grew along the creek banks on his land, purple coneflowers and yellow black-eyed Susans, and something small and white that Ada did not know the name of. They were already a little wilted in the heat. He produced them with the careful, slightly self-conscious air of a man making an offering that he is not sure will be received correctly. She received them correctly. She held them in both hands and looked at them for a moment, and then she looked at him. "They're from the farm?" she asked. "From the creek bank," he said. "The north one near the bend." She held them against her dress front, feeling the warmth of the stems in her hands, and she thought about the creek he had described in the hotel, the morning sound of it, and she felt something bloom in her chest that had no practical name but that she had enough experience of life to recognize. They walked to the edge of town and stood looking out over the prairie, which in late July was a sea of gold and green under the enormous Kansas sky, and Ada held her wilting wildflowers and thought that she was, for the first time in a year and a half, genuinely and specifically happy. Not satisfied, which was what she usually settled for. Not content, which was what Aunt Mildred advocated. Happy. Particular present tense happiness of being exactly where she was. "I've been thinking," Frederick said, and he was looking at the horizon, not at her, in the careful way of someone saying something important to whom the saying of it is a risk, "about whether it would be appropriate for me to call on you, formally." Ada's heart made a noise in her chest that she hoped was not audible. "It would be appropriate," she said very calmly. He looked at her then. "You understand what that would mean, me calling on you? A man in my position, a woman in yours." "I understand what calling means, Frederick," she said. "I'm not concerned about positions. People will talk," he said. "They already are. About the hearing. About you and me walking out of there together. People in Abilene talk about everything," Ada said. "Last winter they talked about the Presbyterian minister's new hat for 4 months. I'm not going to arrange my life around what people say about it." He looked at her for a long moment, and the stillness in his eyes had shifted. That deep-water quality was still there, but something was moving in it now, something warm and alive and trying to reach the surface. "Ada," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without the miss, and the sound of it in his voice was something she felt in her sternum. "Yes," she said. Not answering a question, preemptively, because she already knew what she thought, and she saw no reason to make him struggle toward a precipice if she was already standing on the other side of it. He blinked. Then that smile, the slow, unguarded one that transformed his face, came again, and this time it was softer and more private than any version of it she had seen before. "Then I'll call on Saturday," he said. He called on Saturday. He came to the house on Chestnut Street, and sat in the parlor with Aunt Mildred as the required chaperone, which Mildred undertook with the focused suspicion of a hawk watching an unfamiliar bird at its feeder. Frederick sat in the good chair with his hat in his lap and answered Mildred's questions with the direct, unhurried politeness of a man who had nothing to hide and nothing to prove, and Ada sat across from him and drank tea and watched Mildred's suspicion gradually, reluctantly, convert itself into something that was not quite approval but was at least a temporary ceasefire. He came again the following Saturday, and the one after that. By the third Saturday, Mildred had found a great deal of urgent mending that needed doing at the back of the house, and periodically forgot to return to the parlor for stretches of time that were, technically, longer than strict propriety allowed. Ada and Frederick talked. They talked with the hungry, delighted intensity of two people discovering that the other one is exactly as interesting as they suspected and also more. He told her about Virginia, where he had grown up, the son of a tenant farmer who had worked land he did not own for a man who had barely acknowledged his existence. He told her about the years after the war. He had been too young to fight but old enough to watch what the war did to the men who had, and what it did to the country and the ground itself, and how he had read about the Homestead Act and felt, for the first time, the particular electricity of possibility. 160 acres. His own. If he could get himself to Kansas and break the sod and hold on for 5 years. He had held on for 3.5 years so far. He intended to hold on for the rest of his life. Ada told him about her father, who had built the store from almost nothing with a specific, cheerful stubbornness that she had inherited entirely, and who had taught her to keep accounts and to drive and to read a legal document, and to understand that the world had rules, and that the rules were not always fair, but that understanding them was always better than ignorance. She told him about the 8 months she had run the store after his death, the 8 months that had been, in their terrible, demanding way, the most satisfying period of her life. She told him about the uncle who had taken it from her, and she told him this without self-pity, which was harder than it looked. Frederick listened to all of it. He listened the way she had noticed at the beginning, as if her words were actual things, with weight and meaning, as if she were actually present and actually worth attending to. He asked questions that showed he had been paying attention. He remembered details from earlier in their acquaintance and referenced them naturally, the way a person does who finds another person genuinely interesting. It was, Ada thought on the 3rd Saturday, sitting in the parlor with the late summer light going amber through the muslin curtains, the single most remarkable thing about him. Not the land, not the hearing, not the fact of his struggle, the fact of his attention. In late August, when the heat had begun to ease slightly, and the first hints of fall color had appeared in the cottonwoods along the creek, Frederick Carver asked Ada Ellsworth to come and see the farm. He asked it properly, which meant he asked Mildred first, a conversation that Ada was not present for but which she gathered from Mildred's slightly stunned expression afterward, had involved a degree of formality and sincerity that Mildred had not anticipated from a man in cracked boots. Mildred came to Ada in the kitchen that evening and stood in the doorway and said, "He asked to take you to see his property. He says he would like your opinion on it." "He wants my opinion," Ada said, and she heard her own voice go quiet with something she was not going to name in her aunt's kitchen. "He said, and I am quoting precisely, that your judgment is something he values, and that the farm is the most important thing in his life, and that he would very much like for you to see it." Mildred paused. "He also said that he understands the impropriety of a single woman visiting a single man's property, and that he would be glad to have me come as well." Ada turned back to the bread dough she had been working. "And what did you say?" "I said I would consider it," Mildred said, in a tone that meant she was going to say yes. They went on a Saturday in early September, Mildred and Ada in the buckboard and Frederick on Clement, the aged and dignified mule who regarded Mildred's presence with an equanimity that Mildred herself had not quite achieved. The road north of Abilene ran through country that opened up as the town fell behind, the sky becoming larger and more insistent. The grass on either side of the packed dirt rode the color of old gold. Ada had driven this road dozens of times, but she drove it differently now, looking for the farm, looking for the things he had described. She found them. The house was small, 1-room and a lean-to kitchen addition, solidly built from sod and timber with a small porch facing east so you could sit on it in the morning without looking directly into the sun. It was not pretty by any conventional measure. It was the house of a man who had built it alone with what he had, and what he had was skill and care rather than money. And so the doors were square, and the window frames were plumb, and the fireplace drew well, which Frederick demonstrated by building a small fire and showing them how cleanly the smoke went up. And Ada thought that this was the most intimate thing she had ever been shown. She walked with him to the creek, leaving Mildred in the shade of the porch with a glass of water and a copy of a 2-week-old newspaper, and they stood at the bend he had described, the good bend, the one where the water made its sound, and Ada listened to the creek and looked at the light on the water and felt, with a certainty that was almost geological in its solidity, that this place was real and worth what it had cost to keep it. "You were right," she said, "about the sound." "You can't describe it," he said. He was standing beside her, close enough that she could have touched his arm without moving much. The September air was clear and cool and smelled of grass and water. "Every time I try, I can't get it." "You don't need to," she said. "It describes itself." He turned and looked at her profile, and she knew he was looking, though she kept her eyes on the water. She was learning the weight of his attention, how it felt to have those gray eyes on her. It was not uncomfortable the way being looked at by most people was uncomfortable. It was the opposite of uncomfortable. It was like being warm in a cold room. "Ada," he said. "Yes, I don't have much." He said it plainly, without apology, but also without the false humility of someone making a performance of simplicity. Just the fact. "I have this land and what I can grow on it and what I can build. I've been thinking about what that means and whether it would be fair to say what I want to say, given the difference between what you're used to and what I can offer." Ada turned and looked at him. The directness of it stopped his words. "My father's house is Mildred's house now," Ada said carefully. "The store is Gerald Toff's store. I have $12 and some thread and a good opinion of myself. I'm not sure the difference between our positions is quite what you imagine it to be." He held her gaze. The creek talked behind them. "You know what I'm trying to say," he said. "I do," she said. "And I would like you to say it clearly because I think we are both people who prefer clarity." He did not look away. "I love you," he said. "I think I have loved you since you tied a rope from your buckboard to my broken wagon and then carried a box of nails without being asked. I would like to ask you to marry me, but I want to ask you in a way that means you understand exactly what you'd be saying yes to. Small house, hard work, $11 in a good month, and my undivided attention for the rest of my life." Ada looked at him for one long, clear moment. "That last part," she said, "is the most valuable thing you've named." He reached out and took her hand. He held it with the careful, deliberate warmth of someone who has handled fragile things and knows how much pressure to use. Ada looked down at their joined hands, his calloused, hers not, and felt the creek behind them and the sky above and the enormity of a particular kind of choice. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." The sound he made was not quite words. It was closer to the release of something long held. He pressed her hand briefly against his chest, just for a moment, and she felt his heartbeat, fast and real. They told Mildred on the way back to town. Mildred was quiet for a moment that stretched considerably. Then she said, with the measured fairness of a woman who takes her responsibilities seriously, "He asked me before he asked you, which is correct. He has his own land and no debt, which is more than a good many men can say. He looks at you as if you are the only sensible thing in a senseless world, which is either very good or very concerning, and I have decided it is very good." She paused. "Your father would have liked him." Ada reached over and took her aunt's hand. "I think so too," she said. They were married in October of 1876 at the Abilene Methodist Church, on a morning when the weather had turned sharply and beautifully cold overnight, and the cottonwoods had gone entirely gold, and the sky was the deep blue of autumn in Kansas that makes you believe briefly that the world is actually as beautiful as its best moments suggest. Ada wore her mother's dress, which Mildred had kept in a cedar chest and which had needed very little alteration because Ada and her mother had been built along similar lines, tall and straight-shouldered, capable of occupying space without apology. Frederick had a new jacket. Ada did not know how he had managed it, and she did not ask, because some things you accept without demanding their provenance. It was not the most expensive jacket at the ceremony, not by a long measure, given that her Uncle James was there in his Topeka finery, and two of her father's old business associates attended out of respect for the family. But it fit him perfectly, and he wore it with the same easy dignity with which he wore everything, which was the dignity of a man who knows his own worth regardless of the cost of his clothing. When the minister asked if she took this man, Ada said yes with a clarity and completeness that made the woman behind her audibly catch her breath. When he put the ring on her finger, a plain gold band, bought with money that she suspected had come from selling something, though she never knew what. He held her hand for just a moment longer than the ceremony required, looking at her face with that open, unguarded expression that she now knew was the face he made when he was most entirely himself. They drove to the farm that afternoon, the two of them, in the buckboard with Frederick's mule tied to the back, and Ada's trunk of belongings in the bed alongside the seed grain and the wire fencing coil, and all the other material reality of a life on a Kansas homestead. The sky was enormous and cold and blue. The road stretched north through the gold grass. Ada looked at the farm when it came into view, the small sod house with its eastward porch, the barn, the winter wheat coming up in neat rows in the field, the cottonwood trees along the creek line turned to gold, and she felt something that she would spend many years trying to find the right words for. It was not the feeling of arriving somewhere new. It was the feeling of arriving somewhere you had already been, in the specific future tense of dreams. "Home," she said. Frederick took her hand. "Home," he agreed. The first winter was hard, as first winters always were. The house was cold in ways that no amount of fire entirely addressed, and Ada learned to sleep with extra quilts and to get the fire stoked before she was entirely awake, and to understand why the water barrel needed to be brought inside at night. She learned the farm's particular rhythms the way you learn a piece of music, slowly at first, note by note, and then all at once as the pattern resolved itself into something coherent. She kept accounts. This was her insistence and Frederick's relief. He was a good farmer but not a natural record keeper, and the accounts she maintained in a brown ledger that she bought with her own money told a story, quarter by quarter, of a holding that was thin but viable, that had room to grow if the weather held and the market prices cooperated. She tracked seed costs and labor and yield and sale prices with the same meticulous attention her father had taught her, and at the end of each month she showed Frederick the numbers and they sat at the kitchen table and talked about them. He listened. He always listened. She expanded the garden in spring, a project she undertook with the same cheerful stubbornness she had inherited from her father, digging out the hard prairie soil and amending it with the composted straw from the barn. She grew vegetables with a seriousness of purpose that she had not previously directed at any single endeavor. Potatoes, turnips, beans, squash, and 3 types of green that she had specifically ordered seeds for through the dry goods store. Gerald Toft had looked at her order with the expression of a man, surprised that a farm wife had opinions about seed varieties. She had looked back at him with the expression of a woman who no longer required his approval for anything and gave him her money and took her seeds. The vegetables came up with an abundance that surprised even Ada. Frederick, who had watched her turn hard ground into a producing garden over the course of 3 months, looked at the first full basket she brought inside and said, with genuine wonder, "How did you know they would grow like that?" "I didn't know," Ada said. "I just paid attention to what the soil wanted and gave it what I thought it needed, and then I waited." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she loved. "That is also a description of how I feel about us," he said. Ada set the basket down and kissed him, which was something she did with increasing frequency, and which never lost the quality of being both comfortable and electric, a combination she suspected was unusual and precious. Harlan Graves, as Frederick had predicted, did not accept the hearing's outcome gracefully. In the winter of 1876, there were 2 incidents of fence line damage along the northeastern border of the farm cut wire, which could have been weather-related, but almost certainly was not. Frederick fixed the wire both times and said nothing publicly, but wrote a very detailed letter to the county clerk documenting the damage and the location and the dates, because Ada had told him that documentation was everything, and that a paper trail was the most durable form of self-defense available to a man without a lawyer on retainer. In February of 1877, Graves made a more direct move. He sent a man to the county assessor's office to file a complaint claiming that Frederick's property lines had been incorrectly reconfirmed after the hearing, and that a formal resurvey should be conducted. The assessor, a man named Tom Whitfield who had been a friend of Ada's father and who had watched the land hearing with his own eyes, reviewed the complaint and wrote back a letter so precisely and thoroughly dismissive that it functioned as a legal document in its own right. Ada helped Frederick write his response to the assessor's inquiry, and she showed him the specific sections of the Homestead Act that applied to his situation, and they sat at the kitchen table in the February dark with the lamp between them and worked through it together. And by the end of the evening, they had something that would hold up to scrutiny from any court in the territory. Graves filed no further complaints. The fence line damage stopped. The particular war of attrition that wealthy men wage against less wealthy men through the machinery of law and paperwork came to an end, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet arithmetic of a man who had finally calculated that the costs outweighed the potential gains. Frederick never crowed about it. He said, when Ada pointed out that the trouble seemed to have stopped, "I'll believe it when I'm dead and nothing's happened," which made her laugh and then made her reach across the table and take his hand because she wanted to, because she was a woman who did things because she wanted to and not because propriety required it, and he turned her hand over in his and held it palm up for a moment as if reading something there. The farm grew. Slowly, with the particular stubbornness of things that are given good conditions and allowed to develop at their own pace. By the spring of 1877, they had 40 more acres broken and planted, the additional yield from the expanded operation, allowing Frederick to buy 2 more mules younger than Clement, but taught by Clement's impeccable example, and to add a room to the house. Ada designed the addition herself, very practically specifying dimensions with the accuracy of someone who had spent a lot of time thinking about how interior space affects daily life. And Frederick built it over the course of 6 weeks with help from 2 neighboring homesteaders whom he had helped in previous seasons, and who helped him now without being asked, because that was how neighboring worked on the frontier. The additional room was necessary because in the summer of 1877, Ada told Frederick that she was expecting a child. She told him at the creek, because the creek was where they went for things that needed space. The morning light was on the water and Clement was grazing on the bank nearby with his aged and magnificent disinterest in the affairs of humans, and Ada stood next to Frederick and said, "You should know that by next spring there will be 3 of us." He stood very still for a moment, that deep-water stillness, and then he turned and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was not the contained warmth of early courtship or the steady love of the year just past. It was something more exposed and more vulnerable and more enormous than either of those things. It was the expression of a man who has received something so large that he does not yet have a container for it. He put his arms around her very carefully, and she rested her head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, which was doing something rapid and eloquent, and they stood at the bend of the creek for a long time without speaking, because there was nothing either of them could have said that would have adequately served the moment. "A boy or a girl," he said finally, quietly into her hair. "We'll have to wait and see," she said. "But whoever it is, they'll have a farm to grow up on, and a father who pays attention, and a mother who grows excellent turnips." He laughed that warm, low laugh that she would never stop finding wonderful, and held her a little tighter. The child was a boy. He arrived in February of 1878, in the middle of a snow that had been building since the previous day, and that completed itself sometime in the small hours of the night when Ada was too occupied to notice the weather. Frederick had ridden through the storm to bring the Abilene midwife, a capable woman named Dorothy Crane, who arrived red-faced and pragmatic and entirely equal to the situation, and Ada labored in the room they had built together while the snow came down outside, and the wind argued with the chimney, and Dorothy said encouraging things in a tone that suggested she had seen everything and was not alarmed by any of it. The boy was healthy. He was loud. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's strong opinions, which he expressed constantly and without nuance from the first moment he was capable of expression. They named him James, after Ada's father. Frederick held the baby for the first time with the particular concentrated care of a man holding something he has been trusted with and intends to deserve. He looked at the small, furious face in the lamplight, and then he looked at Ada, who was exhausted and luminous, propped against the pillows with her hair loose and her eyes bright with a tired triumph, and she saw his face go through something it would take her years to fully describe. It was something about the future, the way a man sees the future become suddenly, irreversibly real. "He's remarkable," Frederick said. "He's very loud," Ada said. "He comes by that honestly," Frederick said, and the look he gave her was so full of love that she felt it like warmth on her skin. Mildred came from Abilene when the snow cleared by coach, with a trunk full of useful things, blankets, preserved foods, baby garments she had clearly been making in secret for months. And she sat in Ada's kitchen and held James with the practiced ease of a woman who had raised several children and found the whole business, while trying, fundamentally rewarding. She looked at Ada over the baby's head with an expression that Ada could not immediately categorize. "You look well," Mildred said. "I feel well," Ada said, which was true in the largest sense if not precisely the medical one. "He looks at you," Mildred said, meaning Frederick, who was at that moment repairing the porch step that had split in the cold, visible through the kitchen window. "The way he looks at you, as if you make sense of everything." Ada looked at her aunt. "We make sense of each other," she said. "That's different and better." Mildred considered this for a moment, then nodded. It was the nod of a woman revising a position she had held for a long time, which was one of the more generous things Ada had ever watched her do. The years passed the way good years do, not slowly, because there was too much in them for slowness, but not frantically either. The farm continued to grow, acre by breaking acre, season by season. They added a proper barn in 1879, a structure that Frederick was openly proud of, and that Ada wrote into the accounts with a satisfaction she did not bother to disguise. They got their first real cash surplus in the harvest of 1879, a modest amount by any exterior measure, but by the internal measure of the farm's history, a kind of miracle enough to buy proper winter stores and to put something away, an actual reserve, the first they had ever had. Ada continued to keep the accounts. She also, by 1879, had taken on the informal role of advisor to 3 neighboring homestead families on matters of documentation and legal filings, because she was known to understand these things, and she helped freely and competently, and word traveled. She found this work deeply satisfying in the way she had found running her father's store satisfying, the exercise of a specific, useful competence in service of something real. She thought sometimes about the land hearing, about the moment she had stood up without deciding to stand up, and what that impulse had been, the sight of a man alone at a table with one creased piece of paper and cracked boots, and the absolute certainty that what was being done to him was wrong. She had not stood up because she knew him then. She had barely known him. She had stood up because of something older and more general than personal attachment, a sense of the shape of justice and the specific shape of its violation, which her father had taught her to recognize and which she had apparently been carrying all this time, waiting for a moment that required it. That moment had produced Frederick, who had produced James, who was now, at age 2, a person of formidable opinions regarding Poorest and Clement the mule, whom he followed around the farmyard with a devotion that the old mule tolerated with characteristic dignity. In 1880, they had a second child, a girl this time, dark-haired like Ada's mother, serene in temperament in a way that seemed almost biologically improbable given her parentage. They named her Clara. Frederick held her with the same careful, concentrated love he had held James, but with more ease this time, the ease of someone practicing something for the second time and finding it has not diminished but deepened. James, at 2, regarded his sister with the complex suspicion of someone who has enjoyed being the primary focus of everyone's attention and is not entirely certain about the new arrangement. Frederick handled this with patient ingenuity, consistently finding ways to involve James in Clara's care. Come and show Clara the mule. Help me show Clara how the water pump works, converting potential resentment into responsibility, the way a farmer converts raw ground into something producing. Ada watched him do this and felt the specific kind of love that is not romance and not quite friendship, but something made of both and something beyond both. The love of watching a person you have chosen be exactly the person you chose them for, over and over, in the daily small details of a life shared. On a September evening in 1880, sitting on the eastward porch of the house in the late light, the light that came over the creek and the wheat fields at a long angle and turned everything amber in particular, the light she had come to think of as the farm's own Ada said, "Tell me what you were thinking that day in the land office, when I stood up." Frederick was beside her on the porch bench, James asleep inside, Clara in Ada's arms, Clement visible in the corral. He was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking that I had lost," he said. "Not quite yet, but I could see it. The way you see a fence post going rotten before it goes all the way, you just know. I was thinking about what I was going to do afterward, where I would go." "And then," Ada said, "and then you stood up." He paused. "And I thought, this is a strange thought to have. I thought, who is that? Not because I didn't remember you. I did from the road, from the buckboard. But I thought it in a different way. Who is that person that would do that? What was your answer?" He looked at her, and the amber light was on his face, and she saw in his expression the full accumulated weight of 4 years. The land, the farm, the house, the children, the seasons, the arguments, the laughter, the 1,000 mornings at the creek, the 1,000 evenings at the kitchen table, the whole architecture of a life built together out of the raw material of a rope and a broken axle, and a moment in a courthouse when a woman stood up. "I thought," he said, "that whoever she is the most necessary person I have ever seen." Ada looked at him. The creek made its sound at the bend. Clara slept in her arms, small and warm and real. "I was terrified," Ada said. He raised an eyebrow slightly. "Of standing up?" he asked. "Of the fact that I had to," she said. "That every instinct I was pointing at that table at you and saying, 'This is wrong, do something regardless of what it costs,' that I had no choice about it. That has always been the most frightening kind of knowing." "Did you regret it?" "Not for a single second," she said. "Not then, not now, not ever." He took her free hand. He held it with the same careful, deliberate warmth of the very first time, at the creek, when they had stood looking at the water and everything was still ahead of them and nothing was yet decided. Some things do not diminish with repetition. Some things, the best things, intensify. Clement made a sound in the corral. Clara stirred, didn't wake. The wheat fields went amber in the September light. "We should go in soon," Ada said. "James will wake up hungry." "He's always hungry," Frederick said without moving. "He is his father's son," Ada said. "In that case," Frederick said, "his father is very proud of him." He turned to look at her. "And of you, more than I know how to say, always more than I know how to say." Ada leaned her head against his shoulder. The evening came on slowly and then all at once, the way Kansas evenings did, the sky going through its whole repertoire of gold and rose and deep blue, the first stars appearing one at a time like cautious guests arriving at a party, and the two of them sat on the eastward porch of the house they had built together and looked at the farm that was theirs, truly, legally, irrevocably theirs, and held the small weight of their sleeping daughter between them, and said nothing more because nothing more was needed. 3 years later, in the spring of 1883, Ada found herself in a situation she had not anticipated, and which she had mixed feelings about, and which she ultimately decided to pursue because she was Ada Ellsworth Carver and she pursued things. Tom Whitfield, the county assessor who had so decisively dismissed Harlan Graves's complaint years earlier, was retiring. The position was an appointed one, made by the county commissioner, and it required someone with a specific set of skills: accounting, legal knowledge, document management, and understanding of land records. Ada's uncle James, who was still a county commissioner and who had spent several years quietly revising his opinion of his niece's management capacities, came to the farm on a Wednesday afternoon and sat at Ada's kitchen table and drank her coffee and said with some difficulty that he thought she ought to be considered for the position. Ada looked at him across the table. "An appointed position," she said. "Tom is willing to recommend you specifically," James said. "And I am willing to commission the appointment. You have the qualifications. You have more than the qualifications. You helped half the homesteaders in the county stay on their land by teaching them how to file properly." "People would say things," Ada said. "People will say things regardless," James said, which was the most wisdom she had ever heard from him. She talked about it with Frederick that evening. Not asking permission, she had explained to him early in their marriage that she did not ask permission from him, and he did not ask permission from her, but that they told each other important things and listened to each other's thoughts because that was the arrangement of an actual partnership, but telling him and listening. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The farm needs you here 3 days a week minimum, the accounts and the children." "I know," she said. "If you can manage that," he said, "you should do it. Abilene needs someone in that office who knows what they're doing and isn't for sale." He paused. "And you've been doing the work for free for 3 years anyway. You might as well get paid for it." Ada looked at him. "That is an extremely practical response," she said. "I am an extremely practical man," he said. "You are," she agreed. "You are also the most gracious man I have ever met, and I would like to point that out since I don't always say it." He accepted this with the quiet dignity of someone who has heard something that goes in a deep place. Ada took the position. She rode the 3 miles into Abilene on the county assessor's horse, a reliable brown mare named Harris, provided with the office 3 days a week, arriving before most of the county's other officials and leaving after most of them. And she managed the land records and the assessment filings and the legal documentation of Dickinson County with the systematic precision and absolute integrity of someone who had a personal, foundational understanding of what was at stake in those records. People did say things. Some of the things were unflattering, some were confused. But very few people, after the first 6 months, said that she was not good at it, because she was better at it than anyone who had preceded her, and everyone who dealt with her office knew it. The homesteaders, in particular, the men and women who had come to Kansas with nothing and were trying to build something on land that was simultaneously their home and their only hope, came to her office without the defensive apprehension they had once brought to official settings, because Ada received them as their father had once taught her to receive customers, as people who had something they needed and who deserved to be helped with it rather than managed. Harlan Graves, as the most significant landowner in the county, had dealings with the assessor's office from time to time. Ada handled his filings with absolute correctness and absolute impartiality. She did not punish him for what he had done to Frederick, and she did not favor him for what he had done. She simply applied the law as it was written, the same as she applied it to everyone else. This appeared to disconcert him somewhat, which she privately found satisfying. James, her son, was 6 in 1884 and attended the school in town on the 3 days Ada rode in for work, which meant he rode with her on Harris's back, nestled in front of her with his hands on the pommel and his gray eyes wide at the world going past, asking questions about everything they passed with the relentless curiosity of a child who had been raised by 2 people who took the world seriously. Clara, 4, stayed at the farm with Frederick on those days, and when Ada came home in the evenings, she would find some project of Clara's in progress. A small garden arrangement, a drawing done on the back of an old account paper, something constructed from sticks and string that Frederick had helped without apparently directing, so that it had the specific proud fingerprints of Clara's own vision all over it. She would find them often at the kitchen table together, Frederick reading something aloud to Clara from the farm almanac or the newspaper, Clara listening with the intent expression that was her primary expression, so much like her father in that quality of focused stillness that Ada would sometimes stand in the doorway for a moment before announcing herself, just looking at them. That expression of the two of them at the table in the lamplight was one of the great recurring images of Ada's life. She stored it the way she stored other good things: the light on the creek at morning, the sound Frederick made when he laughed at something she said, the smell of the wheat fields in early summer when the green was so vivid it hurt your eyes. The ordinary miracles of a life that was, by any external measure, simple and not wealthy and relentlessly demanding, and which was, by the only measure Ada considered relevant, exactly everything. In the summer of 1885, a letter arrived at the farm that they had not expected. It was from a land attorney in Topeka, not Harlan Graves's attorney, a different one, a man named Samuel Park, who represented a railroad company that was expanding its line westward across Kansas and had been given, by act of Congress, the right to purchase land along the proposed route. The route, as laid out in the letter, passed through the southwestern corner of Frederick Carver's land, approximately 12 acres, including a section of fence line and the southern end of the wheat field. The letter was polite and businesslike. The railroad company was authorized to purchase the relevant acreage at the standard rate of $3 per acre and requested a response within 30 days. Frederick read the letter at the kitchen table in the evening, and Ada read it over his shoulder, and they were both quiet for a moment when they finished. $36, Frederick said, for 12 acres of my best wheat field. Plus the disruption, Ada said, plus the fence, plus the rerouting of the field drainage. Yes, he said. Ada sat down across from him. Do you want to fight it? He looked at the letter. They have the right, he said. It's a congressional authorization. You can fight it, but you generally don't win. He set the letter down. And $36 is $36. It's your land, Ada said. Your southwestern corner, you broke that sod yourself. I know, he said. He was quiet for a moment. What would you do? I would write back, Ada said, and tell them $36 is insufficient, and that the actual value of disruption to the farm, including lost yield for the seasons during construction, repair of affected drainage and fencing, and the fair market value of productive wheat acreage in Dickinson County, as of 1885, amounts to considerably more than $3 an acre. I would document all of it, and I would send it with the letter. He looked at her, the almost smile. And then I would negotiate, Ada said. They want the route. They don't particularly want a prolonged dispute with a county assessor's office that knows land law. We have more leverage than the letter implies. Frederick looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite define, not surprise, because he had long since stopped being surprised by her, but something that was the mature version of that first expression from the courthouse when he had turned and seen a woman stand up on his behalf without being asked. Recognition, gratitude. Love so established that it had moved past the electric into something that had the quality of permanence, the quality of stone. Write the letter, he said. Ada wrote the letter. She documented the disruption costs in detail, with reference to current market rates and county assessment records, and she made a specific, itemized case for a rate of $6 per acre plus a structural settlement for disruption costs, bringing the total to slightly over $90. The railroad company, whose attorney clearly had not expected this level of precision from a farm wife, or from anyone outside, a Topeka law office, responded with a counteroffer of $4 per acre. Ada wrote back. They settled at $5.50 per acre plus $40 for disruption and fence repair, totaling $106. Frederick held the bank draft in his hands when it arrived and turned it over. $106, he said. Adequate, Ada said, though not generous, but we preserved the creek drainage and we don't have to reroute the access road, which was the important part. Ada, he said. She looked at him. Have I told you lately, he said, that the best thing that ever happened to my life was a woman who wouldn't drive past a broken axle? "I believe you mentioned it at Christmas," she said, "but it bears repeating." He crossed the kitchen and kissed her, which he did as easily and completely as breathing, and Ada leaned into it because she was a woman who leaned into good things. The railroad went through the southwestern corner in the fall of 1885. The construction was noisy and disruptive and cleared the fence line just as predicted, but the crew was efficient and the foreman was a competent man who kept his workers in order. And by November it was done and the line was laid, and a train ran through the southwestern corner of Frederick Carver's land 3 times weekly, which was a strange and not unbeautiful addition to the farm's landscape. James, at 7, was transfixed by it. He stood at the fence line on train days and watched the locomotive go past with an intensity of attention that was entirely his father's, and applied to something that was entirely of the new industrial age. The years continued to accumulate their weight of good things. Clement the mule died in the winter of 1886, at an age that made the fact of his death a resolution rather than a tragedy, though Frederick was quiet about it for several days afterward in the particular way of a man mourning something he is not sure he has the right to mourn because it is only an animal. Ada let him be quiet, and she did not pretend it was nothing, because it was not nothing. Clement had been his companion through the hardest years before Ada, when the farm had been just one man and one mule against the prairie, and the old animal's dignity had been a constant in a life that had very few constants. They buried him at the edge of the north field, where he had liked to graze in the afternoons. James planted a coneflower there in the spring, without being asked, with the natural tact of a 7-year-old, who had been watching his parents do small generous things for other people his entire life, and who had internalized that this was simply how one went about being a person in the world. Ada saw him planted and had to turn away toward the house for a moment, because some things are too good to look at directly. In 1887, their 3rd child was born, another boy, which James was enormously satisfied about and which Clara received with philosophical equanimity. They named him William, after Frederick's father, a choice that made Frederick go very still for a moment when Ada proposed it, and then nod with the deep gratitude of someone being given back something they had not expected to receive again. By 1888, the farm was prospering in a way that would have been unrecognizable to the man who had sat at the petitioner's table in the Abilene land office 12 years before with his cracked boots and his single creased sheet of paper. Not wealthy, the farm would likely never make them wealthy, and neither of them was particularly interested in the kind of wealth that consumed the person trying to get it, but solid. Genuinely, durably solid. Good house, good land, good equipment. 3 children in a school where the teacher knew their names and spoke of them with specific respect. An assessor's office in Abilene that functioned with integrity, and that Ada had built into a model of what a small county office could be when the person running it actually cared about it. They had saved enough by 1888 to build a proper house, not a sod house with additions, which was what the farm had been for 12 years, but an actual timber frame house with proper rooms and a wraparound porch and a kitchen large enough to contain the family's life comfortably. Frederick built much of it himself, with help from neighbors and from James, who was 10 and capable, and who worked beside his father with the serious purposefulness of a boy being initiated into something he considers important. Ada walked through the finished house on a November afternoon, the children at school and Frederick at the barn, and went from room to room with her hands trailing along the walls. The kitchen with its proper iron stove and its south-facing windows. The parlor with the shelves Frederick had built for her books, which had accumulated over the years into a genuine library, the kind of collection that visitors always commented on with slight surprise, as if they had not expected a farm wife on the Kansas prairie to own 37 books. The bedroom with its good solid bed and the quilt Mildred had sent them the first Christmas after the wedding, now considerably softened with use. The children's rooms, one shared between James and William, one for Clara, each one built with a window facing the direction that most suited its occupant, James facing the fields, Clara facing the creek trees. And the wraparound porch, facing east for the mornings and wrapping to the south so you could catch the evening light from the porch swing that Frederick had hung last. Ada stood on that porch in the November cold and looked out at the farm, the fields, the barn, the cottonwoods along the creek line, all of it bare now in the late-year way, stripped of its summer color but present and real and enduring. And she thought about everything the farm had cost and everything it had given. And she thought about Frederick Carver at that table with his cracked boots and his one sheet of paper. And she thought about a woman who had stood up without deciding to stand up and thereby changed the direction of 2 lives. She heard his boots on the porch steps before she heard him. He came and stood beside her, brushing the sawdust from his jacket, looking out at the same view. He had aged, as she had. They were both in their late 30s now, both marked by 12 years of Kansas sun and work and weather, both recognizably themselves and also different people than they had been. Frederick's hair had gray in it at the temples. Ada's face had lines around her eyes that she had earned and did not begrudge. They stood beside each other with the easy proximity of people whose bodies have learned each other over years, not pressed together, not performing anything, just present in the same space, the way 2 things grown in the same soil lean toward the same light. "It's a good house," Ada said. "Yes," he said. "Your best work, I think." "Our best work," he said. "Your kitchen shelves were your specifications entirely. I designed them, you built them, that's how we do things." "That's how we do things," he agreed. They stood looking at the farm in the November light for a while, and the cold was comfortable rather than harsh, the kind of cold that tells you winter is coming but is not yet the thing itself. "Do you remember," Ada said, "what you said to me when you proposed on the north bank of the creek?" "Undivided attention," he said, "for the rest of my life." "Yes," she said, "that." He turned and looked at her. His gray eyes had that quality, the deep-water quality, the warmth beneath the stillness, that she had been learning and relearning for 12 years and that she suspected she would spend her entire life continuing to find new dimensions of. "I meant it," he said. "I know you did," Ada said. "That's why I'm saying it now, because 12 years of it have made me want to tell you that it was the right thing to promise, and you have been exactly right about keeping it." He took her hand. He held it the way he always had, with the careful, deliberate warmth of someone who understands the value of what they are holding. The porch swing moved slightly in the wind behind them. The cottonwoods along the creek shivered their bare branches. "I love you," he said in the same plain, direct, completely unembellished way he had said it the first time, with the same gravity and the same absolute sincerity, as if love were too serious a thing to dress up or dramatize, which Ada had always found to be the most romantic thing about him. "I love you," she said. "Same terms, for the rest of my life." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles briefly, a gesture that was old-fashioned and tender and entirely him. Then he turned back to the view, not releasing her hand. The December sun was low and the light was going amber over the fields. Somewhere near the barn a door banged in the wind. Clara's laughter came from somewhere inside the house. She had gotten home from school and not announced herself yet, just begun to inhabit the space the way children do. Ada listened to her daughter laugh. She held her husband's hand. She looked at the farm, their farm, 12 years of it, hard won and real and enduring, and she felt the weight and fullness of a life that had been built from scratch, from the raw material of coincidence and courage, and the particular willingness to stand up when the moment required it, regardless of the cost. The creek made its sound at the bend. The cottonwoods held their bare arms up to the wide Kansas sky. Clement's coneflower was dead for the winter at the edge of the north field, waiting for spring, which would come as it always came, slow and then all at once, transformative and certain. Everything was as it should be. Everything was exactly, completely, specifically right. And in the spring, as it always did, the farm would wake up again. The wheat would come up green and implausibly vivid against the brown earth, and James and William would race to the creek, and Clara would walk to it seriously as she did everything. And Ada would stand at the kitchen window watching them and then go out to join them. And Frederick would come from the barn, and they would all stand at the bend where the water made its sound, the sound you cannot describe, the sound that describes itself. And the light would be on the water, and the sky above them would be the enormous, indifferent, beautiful Kansas sky, and all of it, every acre of it, every hard-won inch of it would be theirs.